The United States now holds the largest national debt in the world, reaching a level never seen before in its history. Its gross national debt has now crossed $38 trillion, more than 120% of the entire U.S. economy. It once took the U.S. nearly 200 years to reach its first $1 trillion in debt, but today that amount is added roughly every 100 days. Just 2 months ago, in August, the debt was $37 trillion. Before that, it was $36 trillion in November 2024 and $35 trillion in July 2024. This shows the debt is rising at one of the fastest paces in U.S. history. If we break it down, the U.S. added almost $70,000 in debt every second over the last year. And the burden is now so massive that, if this debt were divided equally, every American would owe more than $111,000. The United States debt is almost the same size as the combined economies of China, India, Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom. In simple words, America now owes an amount as big as the world's largest economies put together. On top of that, America's debt-to-GDP ratio is about 120%. Some countries have a higher debt-to-GDP ratio than the US, but America still carries the largest total debt in the world simply because it is the largest economy. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio is the highest in the world at 236%, but its total debt is still much lower than America's due to the smaller size of its economy relative to the US. One of the biggest reasons the debt is growing is fiscal deficit. The federal government spends more money than it collects. For example, over the last 25 years, the US government has spent more money than it collected almost every single year. The only exception was in 2001, when it actually had extra money left over and recorded a surplus of about $130 billion. In the early 2000s, these yearly deficits were still small, but they grew much bigger after the 2008 financial crisis. Then in 2020, the deficit exploded to around $3.3 trillion because the government had to spend heavily on emergency programs during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the 2024 financial year, the U.S. federal government brought in about $4.9 trillion in revenue but spent roughly $6.8 trillion. This created a deficit of approximately $2 trillion, which was financed through borrowing. All of this extra borrowing adds directly to the national debt. Economists believe the government will continue to spend more than it brings in for many years. A big part of this spending goes to major programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which help retirees, older Americans, and low-income families. Defense spending remained one of the highest as the U.S. spent almost $1 trillion on defense in 2024. Over the next decade, the government expects to spend $88 trillion, while tax revenue will only be around $65 trillion. That means there will be a gap of $23 trillion, and that gap is added to the national debt year after year. Another major reason the U.S. national debt keeps rising is the country's aging population. Every day, about 10,000 Americans turn 65. By the year 2030, around 71 million people in the U.S. will be senior citizens. As more people get older, they become eligible for government programs like Social Security and Medicare. At the same time, healthcare costs in the U.S. are rising much faster than in other advanced countries. The United States spends over $14,885 on healthcare per person, which is the highest among OECD nations. A major reason the debt is becoming harder to manage is the rising cost of interest payments. Interest is the extra money the government must pay to lenders for borrowing. In fiscal year 2025, the U.S. government is paying more than $2.6 billion a day just for interest payments, which is nearly $950 billion annually. That's more than the entire U.S. defense budget. Over the past 10 years, the U.S. spent more than $4 trillion just on interest. But in the next 10 years, interest costs are expected to reach $14 trillion, more than triple the amount. As both the debt and interest rates increase, the government has to pay more and more just to cover interest on that debt. When interest payments take up a big part of the budget, less money remains for important things like education, healthcare, infrastructure, and national security. The rising national debt affects everyone in the country. As the government borrows more money, it has to pay more in interest, which can take up a big part of the budget. Higher debt can also lead to higher taxes in the future, or fewer government services. Additionally, high levels of national debt can push interest rates higher. When the government borrows more, lenders see more risk and demand higher interest to lend money. This doesn't just affect the government, it affects everyone. Home loans, car loans, and business loans all become more expensive. When borrowing costs go up, families have less money to spend, and businesses are less likely to invest and grow. This slowdown in spending and investment can make the entire economy weaker over time. The long-term financial picture for the US is worrying. If the government doesn't change the way it collects taxes or cut back on spending, the national debt will keep growing at a pace that is unsustainable. Very high debt can make investors nervous and reduce confidence in the US economy. In the past, agencies that rate a country's credit have even lowered America's credit score because of worries about rising debt and the absence of a clear plan to manage it over the long term. The government has tried to slow down borrowing by reducing spending in some areas and increasing tax revenue. For example, in the last 6 months, the total budget deficit was about $468 billion, which is lower than in previous periods. But even with this improvement, it's not enough. The overall national debt is still growing fast because the government has to spend huge amounts on interest payments and on programs like Social Security and Medicare that provide benefits to millions of Americans. What do you think? Will the US ever pay off this debt, or is it now too large to reverse?